Coming up on Chasing the Natty, it is already week 3 of the college fantasy football season, and we've got to keep it rolling along here. Once again, I'll be giving you guys a couple of players at each of the main positions that I'll be sitting versus starting, and then we'll finish up with some of y'all's fan-submitted start-sit questions. We've got some good ones for you guys here today. I've got all that and more coming right after this.
To go, breaks a tackle, he's 10, he's touchdown! Cook's gonna throw the deep ball, and Burton past the defense, touchdown Luther Burton! Milrow gonna run it again, got a lane, kicked in the turbo, Milrow, goodbye, touchdown Bama!
This is Chasing the Natty, a college fantasy football podcast. All right, welcome in everyone. This is Jared Palmgren, host of the Chasing the Natty podcast. I hope you guys are on a wonderful ride to your work on this Wednesday morning. We are the College Fantasy Football Podcast on the Campus of Canton Podcast Network. You can find us on all of your podcast feeds and on YouTube every Monday and Wednesday morning during the season at 6 a.m. sharp. If you want to support the great work we're doing here, head on over to campusofcanton.com, subscribe there with any of our phenomenal tiers. You'll find everything you need for your CFF, Devi, C2C, college IDP, college DFS, betting needs, pretty much everything you need, whether it's articles, rankings, projections, tools, and even more than that. You can also find me in the show on Twitter. I'm at CFF_Jared. The show is at Chasing the Natty. Y'all, here we are in week 3 of the 2024 college fantasy football season already. It is blowing my mind. It blows my mind every year just how quickly things start to kind of snowball for college football. Like the first couple of weeks, it's like, okay, slow and everything. And then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, week 3, we're almost a fifth of the way through the season already, or at least the regular season already. And like I got surprised in some of my dynasty leagues the other day when we were talking about trade deadlines already. I'm like, oh wow, we're already at that point in the season already. We're starting to think about those kind of things. Well, it's only going to get faster from here. And for those of you who have played in college fantasy before, you know that the roller coaster gets wild and wild from here on out. So, of course, I am back here again to help you get prepared for week 3. For those of you who are just joining us at this point in the season and don't really know what these start-sit shows are all about, basically, it's a very simple format. I got 3 main segments. One is me telling you about some players that I will be starting. These are typically players that are, not heavily rostered, not really obvious guys that you want to start this week. Maybe they've been sitting on your bench. Maybe they're out there on your waiver wire. And then the second segment is some guys that I think are sittable this week. Some guys that have been performing this well up until this point. Some guys that you probably drafted pretty highly. I'll tell you which ones I think should be riding the bench for this week. And then, of course, you guys love it. I take some time to answer some of y'all's start-sit questions at the end of the show. Again, we have about 5 questions here today, so we should be in for some pretty good ones. I went back and forth a lot on some of these, so be looking forward to some of those discussions down the line. That being said, I don't think there's really much else to put out there. I've already gave the spiel on Campus of Canton and everything. Make sure you go check out all the articles that we've been putting out. Again, Chris K's been doing a phenomenal job, and Ethan Sowers have both been doing a great job with the DFS content over there. You got my waiver wire article out every single week. Nate Marquise has his musings in the CFF, or the the Pulse of the CFF Nation article series that he puts out every single week, which is a great place to go and find out some really fun, interesting tidbits from different teams around the country every single week. You basically get to look into the mind of a great CFF analyst like Nate. So go check all of that out. With all that being said, I think there's not really much else to do but except to roll right on into this. So let me go ahead and throw this up on the screen here. Yes, we'll start with our starts for this week. If you're watching on YouTube, you see all 6 of my starts up there. I will give you guys 2 players every single week at each position that I think are startable in leagues. The rules I kind of set for myself at the start of the season was eventually I wanted to get to the point where my only rule would be the player just has to be outside of the top 60 to this point in the season. Well, with weeks 1 and 2, that's a little bit hard because, of the huge variance that happens with FCS opponents. Some people have rough starts to their schedule, and we know for a fact they're going to get better. So, like, for example, I'm not going to tell you to start Sean Atkins this week out of South Florida, even though he's had a disappointing start to the season, because, again, you drafted him knowing that, I don't think anybody expected him not to do well against the FCS opponent, but, you had Bama right there on his schedule. You knew that wasn't going to be a startable week. You're going to throw him right back in your lineup this week. I'm going to try and do my best in the future here to give you guys a name that I think is like kind of mid-tier, probably on your bench, and then I'll probably try to give you guys some names that are potentially just still out there on the waiver wire for you to pick up. So again, I got 2 guys at each position. One guy will be, again, probably on your bench. So I will tell you, like, I would throw them in your lineup this week. Another one, if you say you have a bunch of guys on bye and you really need to go grab somebody off the waiver wire, that'll be that guy here. So we'll go ahead and get started here. We'll start with quarterbacks. Who am I starting at quarterback? Number 1 is TJ Finley, quarterback out of Western Kentucky. He has been off to a rough start this year. I mean, obviously, I don't think anybody really expected him to do well against Bama. He threw the ball 31 times in that game, threw for 92 yards. I think he was pulled at one point, and it just wasn't. Obviously, it was a game that everybody had zero expectations for. Last week against Eastern Kentucky, if you started him in that game, you were definitely a little disappointed as well because he only finished the game with 19.34 fantasy points or 21.34 fantasy points if you're in a 6-point passing touchdown league. But here's the thing. There's just some terrible touchdown luck so far this season with Finley. We know for a fact this is a team that loves to throw the ball. I mean, shoot, last week against Eastern Kentucky, Finley threw the ball 39 times. Now, is it the Zach Kitley, Ben Arbuckle chucking it around 40, 45 times every single game? Not quite there, right? But at the same time, to have thrown the ball 39 times in a 31-0 game and only have scored 1 touchdown, I think that that's some bad luck on his part. If Finley's going to throw the ball that many times and he gets a nice matchup against a conference opponent this week, an even match opponent here, I think Finley's going to get more involved this week. He's actually running a little bit now. It's nothing crazy, but 7 carries, 17 yards against Bama, 3 yards, 13 yards versus Eastern Kentucky last week. That tells me that there's probably going to be some goal line carries for Finley, especially with how big this dude is. I think that he'll get involved in more ways against an actual conference opponent here with MTSU. I personally am pretty confidently starting TJ Finley in the one league that I have a share of him. So the other quarterback that I want to throw out here to start is, again, a little bit deeper here, but I'm going Parker Navarro, quarterback out of Ohio. He gets Morgan State this week, at FCS opponent. That's always a little bit of a roll of the dice there. But I think that there's room here for Navarro to have himself a really solid day, so long as he's not like pulled early or anything. But even still, if he gets pulled early, I think it's because Navarro had himself a really nice day. Either that or Anthony Tyus just goes buck wild. But Navarro's kind of been flying under the radar so far this year a little bit with Ohio, right? Against Syracuse, obviously, we loved what Ohio was able to do against Syracuse, but that was mostly the Anthony Tyus show. Navarro was kind of on the back burner here, 10.54 fantasy points here. But here's the thing. The amount of opportunities that Navarro is getting per game is actually, I'd say, one of the higher ones in all of college football right now, because he is averaging 29 passes per game. He's also averaging 14.5 rush attempts per game as a quarterback, and he's doing decently solid, right? Against Syracuse, again, not the greatest, 2.1 yards per rush, so 16 attempts, 33 yards, but he also got sacked 4 times for 20 yards in that game. So if you just take that away, that's 12 either designed or scrambled attempts that went for 55 or 53 yards in that game. And then last week against Southern Alabama, he had 13 attempts for 62 yards and a touchdown. So we got a dual threat quarterback here in the MAC going up against an FCS opponent in a team that, well, they got a win last week. I don't think that this is FCS opponents are typically like a big downer for Power 4 teams, right? Because you never know how quickly their starters are going to get pulled. It's not exactly the same with G5 opponents, not only because even though I think Ohio is a decent favorite in this game, there's no guarantee that a G5 opponent is going to be that much better than the FCS opponent coming in, especially in the MAC. And so I do think we're looking at a pretty competitive game potentially here that Navarro could absolutely pop off in. So Navarro is my other start. TJ Finley is my first start there among the quarterbacks. Let's move on to the running backs. Running backs here, like I said, I'm going one kind of, I don't want to say semi-obvious, but he's a middle tier guy, got drafted. People know his name, but he's off to a kind of a rough start to the year against Townsend, or I should say the name actually. Corey Kiner, running back out of Cincinnati. Kiner, like I said, bit of a rough start. 7 carries versus Townsend, 51 yards. We were kind of hoping that would be, just a sign of, playing an FCS opponent, that they don't want to put too much wear and tear on him. And I think that's exactly what happened, because against Cincinnati, Kiner got the ball 20 times for 149 yards, averaging over 7 yards per carry. He's been averaging over 7 yards a carry in both of his games so far. The main problem for Kiner is the fact that he just has not found the end zone, whether it's receiving or rushing. I think that changes this week. Cincinnati is going up against Miami of Ohio this week, and a lot of people might be worried, Cincinnati going up against a MAC team, Cincinnati should be able to take care of business. And, there's plenty of scoring opportunities, but there's also potential for a competitive game here. Lest we forget, Miami of Ohio beat Cincinnati at home last year. And so there's quite a possibility that this could actually end up being a relatively competitive game that forces Kiner to stay in the whole time rather than, playing against an FCS opponent here. The other thing that I want to point out is, again, like I mentioned, Miami of Ohio beat Cincinnati last year. And that was embarrassing for Cincinnati. That was embarrassing for the coaching staff. That was embarrassing for the players. I mean, Kiner got killed in this game last year. He had 14 carries for 31 yards and a touchdown. He had 2.2 yards per carry against Miami of Ohio. He's going to want revenge. Cincinnati's going to want revenge in this game. I think they run it up, and I think Kiner has himself a really, really big day. Another running back here that I want to throw out is, this one's a little bit deeper, and I will admit that given my rules I've set for myself where my starts have to be players outside the top 60, I don't think there are really a ton of great running back options for me to go with. But Jacquez Barksdale at Buffalo, the running back out of Buffalo, is starting to intrigue me a little bit. He's off to a really nice start this season. Against Lafayette, he had 14 carries for 99 yards and a touchdown in that game. Against Mizzou, obviously, you don't want to really expect too much there, but he had 15 carries for 67 yards and a catch for 2 yards. So he's averaging about 4.5 yards per carry versus the Mizzou defense. I think is pretty dang solid. This ain't the Mizzou defense of the last couple, or this isn't the Mizzou rushing defense from a couple of years ago that was a cheat code in CFF circles. So it's solid performances from him to start out. And he gets UMass this week. Buffalo's going up against UMass. I'm not going to pretend Buffalo is this clear tier above UMass. Buffalo's clearly got their own problems right now. I don't think Barksdale's won. Because, like I mentioned, against Lafayette, he had himself really nice efficiency there. And it wasn't just from one long run. His longest rush in that game was 19 yards. So he was just consistently popping good run after good run after good run in that game. And so you get UMass this week. I like that matchup quite a bit. I will point out, though, that UMass has performed pretty well against the rush so far this year. According to our numbers from C2C Winning Edge, their rushing defense team performance is currently 48th in the country. To give you context, the entire team performance for UMass over the last 3 years has averaged out to be 104th in the country. So currently, UMass's rushing defense is way overperforming where we normally see UMass's defenses perform. That could spell trouble for a guy like Barksdale. Here's the thing, though. If you look at the two teams that UMass has faced so far, it has been Eastern Michigan and Toledo. Two teams that I think are still trying to find something with their rushing game. They still haven't quite figured it out. Meanwhile, Buffalo, I think, knows what they have to do in order to win games, right? They currently have a living potato at quarterback. His name is CJ Agbana, right? He's less than 50% completion so far this year. Nobody, when he was named the starter, nobody was sitting there wondering like, oh boy, this guy can have some potential to him. No, everybody knew that he was going to be something that was going to limit this offense in that way. But now Buffalo knows, kind of like Oregon State, that they have to run in order to win. And so I think that's going to heavily benefit Barksdale here in a competitive game against UMass. Through 2 games, Barksdale hasn't broken away in terms of the carries compared to Aljay Henderson. I believe Barksdale's at 29 versus Henderson's at 21. But if you look at their efficiency, Barksdale is clearing Henderson. He's got 5.7 yards per carry compared to only 3 for Aljay Henderson. I think that continues, Barksdale will start creeping up from the 14 to 16 touches. Potentially down the line, we could see him increase all the way up to 20, 25 carries or touches per game. And it's a decent chance, in my opinion, you get UMass this weekend. This is where we see it happen. So those are my 2 starts at running back, and Corey Kiner and Jaquez Barksdale. At wide receiver, I got Kobe Hudson, the wide receiver at UCF. Again, a semi-rough start to the season. Again, very similar to Corey Kiner. It's just hasn't been able to find the end zone. You can thank RJ Harvey for that and him stealing. I think he's got 7 touchdowns so far this year. Like, good Lord. They get TCU this weekend. This is one of the highest over-unders of the weekend. I believe it was 61, and I believe that UCF is only favored by 2, so it's going to be a back-and-forth affair here. If UCF is going to win this game, KJ Jefferson has to find this passing game and has to find Kobe Hudson, point-blank period, right? I think they've been able to get by the last couple of weeks against New Hampshire, against Sam Houston. Those are teams that they can just hand the ball off to RJ Harvey and run up and down on them all day long. And I'm not totally unconvinced they can't do that against TCU. But my point is that, again, you have a much harder opponent here, a game that's expected to be pretty much dead even here. UCF has to be able to be multiple in their offense, and Kobe Hudson's going to be key to that. I think he has a pretty big week against TCU, especially if this game turns into a shootout. Last wide receivers that I'm going to start here. Again, one of these guys, again, was drafted. The other one is still available on a lot of waiver wires, but I'm going to combine both of the Georgia Southern wide receivers here. Georgia Southern's got South Carolina State this week. I consider putting J.C. French as one of my starts at quarterback here as well. I just think that this offense is going to be in for a pretty big day this weekend, right? They got embarrassed in some ways against Boise State. Boise State just throwing up almost 60 points on them, and they had having to come from behind, scoring 45. Then they go to Nevada, and they struggle. The offense struggles mightily in that game, where they only score 20 points on the board. I think they come home, they get South Carolina State, which is not a good FCS team whatsoever. I think that this is a spot where Georgia Southern wants to really get this offense clicking. I think that we will see J.C. French really try to lock in his passing a little bit here, and that's going to be a big benefit to guys like Derwin Burgess and Dalen Cobb. I mean, Cobb's been the safe floor out of these two guys the last couple of weeks. Again, 16.5 fantasy points versus Boise, 17.6 versus Nevada. You've seen him average 7.5 targets per game. Meanwhile, Burgess is the guy that is actually getting the higher targets here. Against Boise, Burgess had 9 targets. Against Nevada, he had 10 targets. He just hasn't been able to reel it in and kind of break off those big plays, except for, again, against Boise State, where he broke off a 48-yard reception, but just couldn't find the end zone. I think that changes this week. I'm willing to start both Burgess and Cobb and hope that Georgia Southern's able to run up 50 on poor South Carolina State, and these guys are at the center of it. And I'm hoping to see more out of Jalen White. If you want more information on that, go check out my waiver wire show from earlier this week as to why I'm a little worried about Jalen White moving forward, but hopefully he gets back to normal. All right, let's keep this moving here. Let's go to my sits here as soon as I find the right button here. There we go. Let's move on to my sits here. My 2 quarterbacks, I think I'm mostly putting out here as just one. My options were limited because, again, my rule that I'm keeping to it this week is the players must be inside the top 40 at their position in order for me to call them a sit, right? To this point in the season. So that takes off a lot of the guys that were kind of disappointed to this point in the season who also have tough matchups, and it kind of left me a little limited here. My two quarterbacks to sit this week are Jalen Raynor and Devin Dampier, quarterbacks out of Arkansas State and New Mexico, respectively. Raynor's off to a really, really nice start. He scored 30-plus points in both of his games so far. Dampier, obviously, a little rough to start against Montana State, had a phenomenal performance against Arizona the following week. He was off a bye last week. He's got Auburn this week. Jalen Raynor's got Michigan. They're pretty self-explanatory here on both of these, right? You got G5 quarterbacks going up against Power 4 defenses here. Yes, I saw what Dampier was able to do versus Arizona. Yes, I know that New Mexico State last year was able to not only beat Auburn, but just straight up embarrass them in their own home. You know for a fact Hugh Freeze is not going to let that happen, especially since Auburn already kind of has their early embarrassing loss at home for the season with Cal last week. I think Freeze has these guys come out. I think he's going to challenge them to completely shut down New Mexico this week, set the standard for the rest of the season. And I unfortunately think that Dampier will be at the center of that, and he'll be greatly limited. And then same thing with Raynor, right? Self-explanatory. Michigan has historically crushed G5 offenses, and so I'm not even worried about that. Running backs. Let's see what we got here. We got Marquez Cooper, running back out of San Diego State. He's going up against Cal this week. Man, what an incredible performance week one. When they just couldn't get anything going with Danny O'Neal in that passing game, they just turned to Marquez Cooper and said, all right, your time to shine. 27 carries, 223 yards, and 2 touchdowns, along with 3 receptions for 10 yards right there. Boy, oh boy, what a start. I was curious the next week to kind of see what it looks like when Marquez Cooper and really just the San Diego State offense goes up against a Power 4 defense in Oregon State, and, well, they got completely shut down. Marquez Cooper, 13 carries, 53 yards, and no touchdowns. He also had 2 receptions for 19 yards as well. I think, again, just kind of following what we saw last week, this offense just isn't ready to take on, Power 4 level defenses. And so I think because of that, you have to sit Marquez Cooper again this week against Cal. Not that Cal has the toughest defense in the world or anything like that, but neither did Oregon State. And, they were able to shut down San Diego State pretty well there. I think this is just one of those things where with Cooper, you just have to wait for Mountain West play and go from there. My other sit for this week is actually a guy that I told everybody to start last week, and I'm sitting him this week, unfortunately. And that is Damon Claiborne, the running back out of Wake Forest, going up against Ole Miss. Solid performances from Claiborne all around the last couple of weeks. Again, 17 carries, 135 yards, and a touchdown versus an FCS opponent. 21 carries, 86 yards, and 2 touchdowns against Virginia last week. He is a very, very key part of that Wake Forest offense moving forward, and I really like his rest of season value here. The problem is that Ole Miss is coming to town. Now, it helps, I think, that Wake Forest is playing at home a little bit here, but regardless, Ole Miss is coming to town, and as, not inspiring, what's the word I'm looking for? As optimistic as one can be about Wake Forest moving forward. Again, I've been impressed with Hank Bachmeier so far. I like that Donovan Green's really coming back. Taylor Warren's always a steady piece there. And of course, I've talked so much about Claiborne. As much as I like the pieces and I like the direction that Wake Forest is going, I do not think that this is an offense ready to take on Ole Miss's offense. And more particularly, I'm not sure that Wake Forest is prepared for Ole Miss's defense. And that might sound crazy because, again, Ole Miss isn't exactly known for their defense, but let's not forget that Ole Miss spent money in the portal this offseason, getting one of the best pass rushers out of Florida, going to get Walter Nolan over from Texas A&M. They were putting some serious money into loading up some talent on this defense, to the point where, according to, once again, C2C Winning Edge numbers, Ole Miss is currently the 3rd highest roster strength on defense in the country. Not the SEC, not the Power 4, the entire country. In addition to that, according to stats so far this year, granted Ole Miss hasn't really played like anybody tough yet, Their defense is currently 4th in team performance and 3rd in team rushing defense performance, right? So, yes, of course, like I said, you can point out to Ole Miss's schedule so far and just say, like, oh, they've just been beaten up on lesser teams. Of course, they're going to have some good defensive stats there, to which I partially agree. My deal is with Damon Claiborne, right? He's not the biggest receiving back in the world. He's a guy that absolutely could get game scripted out of a game here. And I'm not willing to roll the dice on Ole Miss's defense just being worse than they are on paper, right? Again, they've done nothing but do good this year. Maybe that changes against a Power 4 opponent, but with Damon Claiborne, I think I'm looking elsewhere for some better matchups there. I think that there's a good potential that Ole Miss could get things very ugly versus Wake Forest. So I'm avoiding that situation for right now. And then wide receivers. I am going to sit Ricky White, wide receiver out of UNLV. He and the Rebels are going up against Kansas this week. A bit of a rough start in week 1 versus Houston. 5 targets, 2 receptions, 11 yards. A lot of people were asking me to put him on the freakout scale that next week. I did not, because I figured this was just kind of fluky. 5 targets, 2 receptions. Maybe that's not an issue. Then he comes back next week against Utah Tech here. 6 targets, 5 receptions, 111 yards, and 3 touchdowns. That's the Ricky White that we all know and love, right? My problem is, and again, I fought Chris Moxley about this during the offseason, that, I'm like, I'm not worried about Matthew Sluka. He's not going to change this offense too much. UNLV has passed the ball 31 times this year. Not in a single game, in 2 games. They are not passing at a very high caliber at all. In fact, it's extremely low caliber. Ricky White's target share is actually shot up. He's getting close to 40% of this team's targets. The problem is 40% of 31 basically brings you down to an unmanageable level, right? That is, again, you're looking at 5.5 targets per game. That's nothing compared to what White was getting last year. And then you throw in on top of everything else that UNLV is going to Kansas, right? That, I think, can spell some serious trouble. Now, Ricky White's a talented dude. He is, in my opinion, a Power 4 level wide receiver playing at the G5 level. So it's not going to be unheard of that he can probably still shake those Kansas defenders and probably find himself doing well. Problem is, I don't trust the rest of that UNLV offense, right? I don't trust the O-line. I don't trust Matthew Sluka to do well against Power 4 competition. Granted, he did well against Boston College last year, but regardless, that definitely wasn't throwing the ball when he did well for that. So with all that being said, I just think it's a bad matchup with Ricky White with the lower amount of passing. I think I'm sitting Ricky White and just kind of seeing what happens there, right? Maybe you start Ricky White back up again the next week, but if we get another week where UNLV's passing the ball like a max of 15 to 20 times, oh boy, that spells some big trouble for Ricky White moving forward. And then the other wide receiver that I'm going to sit here is another kind of self-explanatory one, but he's a little bit deeper. But Luke Floria, wide receiver out of Kent State, actually really solid last couple of weeks, right? Against Pitt, 11 catches, six receptions, 104 yards, and a touchdown. And then against St. Francis last week at a game they lost. Woof. You see Floria get 8 targets, 6 receptions, 92 yards, and a touchdown in that game. I think there's a decent chance that Tennessee just completely body bags Kent State. I think there's a decent chance that Kent State doesn't put up any points this weekend. Tennessee has been known to just completely crush G5 opponents in the past, and that makes it to where you are probably going to see Floria have his worst game of the season this next upcoming weekend. So for that reason, if you have been starting him because of this solid production last couple of weeks, I think this is a week to sit him. Unfortunately, he gets another Power 4 opponent next week, and then finally he gets into MAC play, and then it's full speed ahead for Floria. So with all that being said, that's my sits and starts for the week, or my starts and sits, whatever you want to say. Again, just to recap, my my starts are TJ Finley, quarterback out of Western Kentucky, Parker Navarro, quarterback out of Ohio, Corey Kiner, running back out of Cincinnati, Jacquez Barksdale, running back out of Buffalo, Kobe Hudson, wide receiver out of UCF, and then the two Georgia Southern wide receivers in Derwin Burgess and Dalen Cobb. And then my sits for the week, Jalen Raynor, quarterback out of Arkansas State, Devin Dampier, quarterback out of New Mexico, Marquez Cooper, running back out of San Diego State, Damon Claiborne, running back out of Wake Forest, Ricky White, wide receiver out of UNLV, and then Luke Floria, the wide receiver out of Kent State. All right. With all that being said, let's get on over to our fan-submitted start-sit questions of the week. If you want to get your start-sit questions submitted and get onto the show, the best way to do that is to go follow the @ChasingTheNatty Twitter account. I put out a tweet every single week to load up on those. You can also follow me at CFF_Jared because I always retweet that tweet with the other account as well, and make sure that people have a place to put down all of their start-sit questions. And what happens here is I'll go through all of those, and I'm going to pick the best 5 of the week, and then we will run through those. And then I'm not always the best about it, but I do try to come back around like Thursday-ish to run through all the ones that I wasn't able to get to on the show, and then answer all those questions just through, written text rather than, answering here on the show. So, like I said, if you want to get involved at Chasing the Natty, be on the lookout for those tweets. That being said, let's get on over into these sit-start questions for the week. And the first one here we have from our good buddy at Realist Chris K. Normally, I try to go for only fans of the show, but K had a really good question here, but 2, I know for a fact that there's some context behind this question that is involving a shared team between 2 managers that are currently fighting. And so, being the good guy that I am here to settle this marriage dispute between Chris K and his partner here. So, what is this question that is causing so much strife for this team? And that is Matthew Sluka running or quarter. That was almost a serious whatchamacallit, Freudian slip right there. Matthew Sluka, the quarterback out of UNLV, or we can go with Mikey Keene, the quarterback out of Fresno State. Sluka's going up against Kansas, like I mentioned a little bit ago with Ricky White. And then Mikey Keene is going up against New Mexico State this weekend. This one's a little tough. On one hand, you have Sluka. He's a dual threat option. He is going to provide you a pretty safe floor with his rushing ability, right? That's kind of his main game, as we've seen. They don't want him to pass the ball a ton here. But he's got the worst matchup out of these 2. Pretty easily with UNLV going up against Kansas here. Granted, UNLV did do pretty all right against Houston, but I'm not going to count on that to happen again here. I think Houston's just an absolutely horrendous team. But on the other hand here, you have a mostly pocket passer in Mikey Keene, who's not going to provide you that safe rushing floor, but easily, like I said, easily out of the 2 has the nicer matchup. I think the pro Sluka argument here is, like I mentioned, dual threat. I think he's more likely of these 2 to monopolize touchdowns this weekend, whether he's throwing them or running it into the end zone, versus Keene. He's going to have to fight with Malik Sherrod in terms of getting those touchdowns. So I would say that Sluka, just because of his dual threat ability and, again, UNLV's ability to actually produce against Power 4 competition so far, I think provides him the higher ceiling of the 2. But then when it comes to Keene, like I said, he's probably the safer floor of these 2, even with, without that rushing ability, just because of the matchup here, right? You have New Mexico State. They're favored by almost 20 points in this game. You should be able to see Keene have himself a pretty solid day. In 2023, Keene hit 25 plus fantasy points only 4 times, one of which, though, was against New Mexico State. New Mexico State now is pretty clearly a much weaker team this time around. I think that Fresno State's going to absolutely body bag them this weekend. So now to answer the actual question, initially I thought I was going to go with Sluka here, right? Again, the higher upside here, I'm like, okay, maybe if he works, it's awesome. If he doesn't work, there's other ways to make up for it. Here's the problem. I know this is a deep league. Chris specifically says that, and I know what league this is. This is the 50-teamer. So there's not a ton of room for error every single week with your starts and sits, right? I think in a league like this, where QBs are at a very big premium, I think you have to go with the safer option out of Keen, because if you miss on your quarterback, if your quarterback fails you in that league, there's a good chance that you are done for the week, right? And I think that, you go with Keen. I think you lock in your 20, 25 fantasy points here with their performance against New Mexico State this weekend. And then you save your upside plays for, wide receivers who we already kind of say, or we go with your wide receivers who we already kind of just know there's more variance there, right? There's more risk. There's more higher upside, bigger lows, right? You're okay with some boomer bust plays there. I don't think you can really play that same game quarterback. And so I say go with the safer option. Give me Keen. So I just realized I didn't put my tokens up. So let me put my tokens up. There we go. All right. Oh, missing one. There we go. So yeah, sit Matthew Sluka and start Mikey Keen out of these two, which feels weird to say in a vacuum, but that is where we're at. All right, moving on to our next question here, which comes to us from Sidewalk Buffalo at Sidewalk Buffalo on Twitter. He is asking to start two quarterbacks in a 6-point passing touchdown league between Kaidon Salter, who's going up against UTEP this weekend. We have Garrett Nussmeier, quarterback out of LSU, or Baron Morton, the quarterback out of Texas Tech. This is a very interesting question. I rattled this back and forth in my mind a ton when I first looked at this, and I knew I had to put it on here because there's a legitimate argument for all three of these guys, and there's legit cons to each and every one of them, right? We'll start with Salter here. Salter, we drafted him in the first round of leagues for a reason, right? Yeah, he started off pretty slow. And I mean, actually really slow. Like against Campbell, 22.48 fantasy points. Against New Mexico, 12.54 fantasy points. Just not the Salter production that we are used to seeing the last couple of years. Last year, right? But I think he's going to get going here soon. He's not getting any less volume than he did last year. I just think the main problem here is that he's just not finding the end zone. He scored 2 touchdowns in 2 games so far this year. That is a complete anomaly to what he was doing last year. The touchdowns should regress, and Liberty's expected to roll in this game. They're favored by 23. I think there is a solid chance for a really big day from Salter here. The pro Nussmeier argument is also interesting. 6-point passing touchdowns obviously helps Nussmeier a lot here. Otherwise, I don't think this would necessarily be close. And despite, he's going to be at South Carolina this weekend. Despite South Carolina's dominance of Kentucky last week, I do think that Nussmeier should be able to find the end zone pretty easily here. Again, the team total, according to Vegas, is 28.5. That's pretty solid. And thanks to LSU's terrible rushing offense so far this season, God rest John Emery Jr. and his injury, because I actually think he could have been pretty solid for LSU given what he was doing in that USC game. Without LSU's rushing attack working at all, Nussmeier's going to be able to monopolize some scoring opportunities in this game. And I think it'll be a lot like last week, right? Where there's a decent chance where if LSU puts up 35 points, all 5 of those touchdowns come from Nussmeier. And then last but not least, we have the pro Morton side, right? The Baron Morton going up against Texas Tech this weekend. Morton had himself a phenomenal game in week 1 and an absolutely terrible game against Wazoo the next week, going from 34.62 fantasy points in week 1 to 17.62 in week 2. But the good news is that he's going up against North Texas this week, who we already know have a pretty rough defense. Again, the over-under in this game is 69.5 That's one of the highest on the week. Texas Tech's pretty favored, is favored by 9.5. So if you're doing the math at home, Vegas doesn't think we're going to get a repeat of what happened last week. They're pretty certain that this offense for Texas Tech is going to be able to get rolling against North Texas, right? And then there's the other kind of wild card here, right? What goes on with Taj Brooks? If Taj Brooks is out for this game, I think it's both a blessing and a curse. What, right? Because one, on the blessing side of it, right, Morton's going to be more likely to monopolize touchdowns. Again, they have Cameron Dickey. They have the other guy there. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. But neither one of those guys are Taj Brooks. That offense was struggling to run the ball last week without Brooks there. And that's kind of the curse side of this, right? Without Brooks out there, does this offense continue to struggle even with a lower end of competition to go up against this week? I don't know. When it comes to actually picking between the guys I'm actually going to start here, I think I'm gonna ride with Salter. Again, he's got to have a good performance here in the next couple of weeks. I highly doubt that they're able to get him to stay at Liberty. He entered the transfer portal at one point, and they got him to come back to Liberty. They're not getting him to come back to Liberty just to not do anything, right? So I'm going to ride with Salter. I think they beat up on UTEP this week. And then between Nussmeier and Morton, I think I'm going to lean Morton just because of that high over-under for the game, just because of the shootout potential. So I'm going to, again, just recapping, I'll start Salter, start Morton, and sit Nussmeier. I think it's very, very close. But again, Morton's got the dual threat ability that we know he can use. And he has the better matchup between him and Nussmeier. So I'm going to go that way. But I don't feel super great about it because, again, I know Morton can have some real stinkers out there in games that he should be phenomenal for. So let's move on to our third question here. This one comes to us from Mike Lagos at Magic Knight 44 on Twitter. It says, "Hello, Jared. In a half PPR league, I need 2 wide receivers from these options, and his 3 wide receivers that he needs me to choose between are Chris Hudson at Washington, Coleman Owens at Ohio, going up against Morgan State this week, and then Jeremy Bernard, wide receiver out of Alabama, going up against Wisconsin this week." I don't love any of these options, I'll be real with you, Mike. And now granted, like, this is probably maybe your third option that you're kind of looking at for your team, so I imagine you have some better options here. We'll kind of run through these 3 real quick, right? The pro Hudson argument, one, it's a rivalry game, so you expect everybody to be playing hard in that game. It is the Apple Cup. He is averaging about 6.5 targets per game the last 2 games, which isn't, great, but, it's not bad either, right? There's plenty of opportunities there. Again, he is playing on the outside, so he's going to get some of those higher value, long A-dot targets, right? My main drawback for Hudson compared to Owen and Bernard is that Hudson's one of many options that John Mateer has to work with, whether, Kyle Williams, obviously Chris Hudson, but then, Tony Freeman, Josh Meredith, they are all still around. They are all still getting targets. Wayshawn Parker out of the backfield as well. Like, Hudson's got to fight for those targets compared to guys like, Owen, who has the best target numbers out of all 3 of these guys at 10.5 targets per game. He's got the SES opponent. I kind of mentioned this earlier with Parker Navarro. I really think that Ohio is going to want to put up some numbers against an FCS opponent this weekend. I think that could greatly benefit Coleman Owen here. And then last but not least, Jeremy Bernard. People keep asking for me to put him back on the freak out list because, he basically did nothing in week 1. Week 2, he was the leading target for Alabama, but still didn't have that kind of really big game that you were looking for, especially against a G5 opponent here. Bernard's got the highest pedigree among these 3 options. Like I said, he had 7 targets last week against USF. But here's the thing. Of these 3 options, I'm still going to go with Bernard and still go with Owen. I think that Bernard is one of, 1A and 1B of Alabama's passing attack right now. Owen's clearly the number 1 option for this Ohio passing attack. They both have decent matchups this week. I don't love that matchup against Wisconsin for Alabama. Again, I think over-under in that game is like 50. So I'm not expecting a ton of scoring opportunities, but even still, just having Bernard be one of those top 2 options in that offense feels good. Versus Hudson, I really think that you're kind of playing a little bit with fire in terms of which Wazoo wide receiver is going to pop off outside of Kyle Williams of the week. So give me Owen, give me Bernard. I don't really love any of them. But again, I think I would, if I was running this team, I'd go Owen, I would go Bernard. So move on to our next one here. This one comes to us from Adam Huddle at HuddleA12 on Twitter. He is asking us between a wide receiver and 2 running backs to start one in a full PPR league. So he is asking between Giles Jackson, wide receiver out of Washington, or Jam Miller, the running back out of Alabama going up against Wisconsin, or we can go with Khalil Mullings, running back out of Michigan. I'll go ahead and tell you my last place one here, and that is Jam Miller. He's averaging 10 touches a game. Granted, he has had some pretty insane efficiency, almost averaging 10 yards per carry, but regardless, like, we're not seeing Alabama really rely on Miller and Hayes, and even still, Haynes is splitting carries pretty evenly with Miller. I think Miller has slightly more carries here, but regardless, this is expected to be a relatively slow game, over under 50.5 points. You're giving me a guy that's basically dead even with his other options in terms of carries, and you give me another power 4 matchup. I think that Miller is probably my last place guy here. That leaves Khalil Mullings and Giles Jackson. Mullings is interesting, right? Because again, Michigan, they're back to beating up on lesser competition. I do wonder if we see Michigan pull a Clemson here, where after getting embarrassed by Texas last week, they kind of run it up versus whatever next opponent they have, just to see their offense actually clicking, just to prove that they can actually execute it. And it was just a level of competition that they need to work on, right? And if that's the case, I think Mullings gets a ton of carries. He's, like I mentioned before, he's actually out-carrying Donovan Edwards to this point in the season. And I think there's plenty of goal line opportunities for Mullings in a game like this against Arkansas State. I think he absolutely could finish the day with 2 touchdowns. So I don't think Mullings is a bad pick. My only thing is, though, in a full PPR league, running backs do take a hit, especially running backs like Mullins who don't catch the ball, right? Michigan's targeted Mullins 1 time in 2 games. That's just not his game. Donovan Edwards is their receiving back. They're not going to throw it to Mullings here. So who does that leave? That leaves Giles Jackson, which might surprise some people here. But here's the thing. Love Boston College. Love Denzel Boston. He's got 3 touchdowns so far this year. He's doing really well for the Huskies. But if I were to ask you who is the number 1 target for Washington through 2 weeks, if I didn't tee it up with talking about Giles Jackson, I guarantee you half of you at least would not say Giles Jackson. He's silently had a very solid volume over the last couple of weeks. He had 16 targets through 2 weeks, so averaging 8 targets per game. He leads the Huskies in targets right now and in receiving yards, just no touchdowns. So that tells me that, again, there's just a little bit of touchdown luck, and I think that might be remedied this weekend. He'll be playing versus Washington State. Should be a decently high-scoring affair between those 2 teams. I think Giles Jackson finds the end zone this week, and in a PPR league, right, where you get 8 targets, if he brings in just 6 of those, right, that's a solid floor for your wide receiver, solid floor for this play at flex. I like Jackson the most out of these 3 guys. So with that being said, we'll move on to our final question of the day here. This one comes to us from Bill Lacing at Bill_Lacing on Twitter. He is asking another flex question as well. He says, full point PPR league, we need to pick one between Anthony Tyus, the running back out of Ohio, going up against Morgan State this week, or we can go with Cameron Cook, the running back out of TCU, going up against Central Florida this week, or we can go with Mac DeLana, the wide receiver out of Fresno State, going up against New Mexico State this weekend. Talk about Tyus this weekend. He's averaging 17.5 touches per game, pretty solid, right? Ohio should be able to run roughshod over Morgan State, right? They should be favored in this game. My big thing, right, is how does Ohio handle being in the driver's seat for the game, right? They've been playing from behind. They've been playing competitively against South Alabama last week, right? What do they do once they're actually ahead by a decent amount? Do they still keep handing it off to Tyus? Do they get Ricky Hunt even more run? I think there's still some questions that need to be answered there. Cook is very similar to Tyus in the fact that, he's averaging 17.5 carries per game. The thing that I think puts Cook over Tyus here is that we know for a fact that this game against UCF will be competitive, and that'll force Cameron Cook out onto the field this weekend. Their over-under is a 61.5. UCF only favored by 2.5. So both teams basically expected to hit 30 points in this game. We already have seen with Cook getting 4 touchdowns in the last 2 weeks that TCU is not afraid when they get close to the red zone to just ride on Cook, and I think he'll be in for a pretty solid weekend. I think he might be the safest play among these 3 options, given the fact that when we saw him last at a competitive game, he got 21 touches versus Stanford. I think we can absolutely chalk that in this weekend for Cook to do well. The last one here is Magdalena, wide receiver out of Fresno State. Very similar to Giles Jackson. Full PPR is always going to help receivers, right? And given the fact that we have seen Delana get 17 targets and 13 receptions through 2 games so far, yeah, PPR is going to help him with a solid floor very, very well here, right? His efficiency has also been nuts. He's got 23.2 yards per catch. And for those of you who might be saying, like, oh, maybe that's him breaking a long run. Maybe that's him. Well, he did get a long touchdown. Don't get me wrong. He got a 77-yard touchdown last week. But in terms of, like, they threw it to him at the line of scrimmage and he just broke a big one, right? Nope. His ADOT, 16.1 yards. That is the highest amount on the team. And that's a pretty insane ADOT for a wide receiver to average here. And so I think he's in for a really solid weekend here. Fresno State, they get New Mexico State, who I mentioned earlier is even weaker than they were last year. Fresno State's favored by almost 20 points. They'll be able to score in this game. In addition, I'm careful with some of these, right? Because I've gotten burned on it before. Shoot, I literally just got burned on it last week when I told everybody to start Malik Rutherford and he'd do well against Syracuse. That did not work out. But even still, if you look at what New Mexico's done so far this year, the outside wide receivers for both offenses that they've faced have done well. Dorian Anderson, the wide receiver out of Southeast Missouri State, got 6 catches, 115 yards, and a touchdown. And then last week, Trayon Sibley, the wide receiver out of Liberty, 5 catches, 155 yards, no touchdowns, but regardless, that's still a ton of production. I think it's possible that both Jalen Moss and Magdalena have themselves really, really solid weeks this week. So I think because of the PPR format, because of the matchup, I'm going with Delana. Because I think he gets the higher ceiling with a solid floor. If you want to go just pure floor play, I think Cook's your guy. But if you want to go a little bit higher, I think Delana is going to be the guy that you're going to want to go for. So, let me get ahead and throw up my starts here. And my sits, my tokens there. There we go. All right. Unfortunately, Bill, I would say that you should probably find a way to get both Cook and Delana into your lineup there, but we'll see. I'll go with Delana of those 3. All right. With that being said, appreciate all of you guys for tuning into another Start Sit show. Again, we're trying to keep these for about roughly an hour, and we did pretty well on that today. I want to appreciate all of you guys for listening. If you have not already, go ahead and leave a like, a comment, and subscribe. If you're watching this on the YouTube side of things, if you're on the podcast side of things, make sure you follow the show. Leave a 5-star review wherever you can. I know on Spotify, they only let you leave the 5 stars, but on Apple Podcasts, they let you leave those written reviews. And let me tell you guys, those help out a ton for future advertisers. And so if you want to help us find ways to get the show even more revenue, to provide an even better show down the line, make sure that you go and help us out, do your part, and just leave those little reviews over on Apple Podcasts. They help us out a ton. With all that being said, good luck to all of you guys in week 3 of your leagues. I hope every single one of you is 3-0 by the end of this week. Until then, we'll see you guys back here next Monday for our next round of waiver wire picks. Until then, really appreciate you guys. I hope you have a wonderful and blessed week. See y'all.